The cellar door creaked open just before first light, and the smell that rolled up from below was something a man never forgot. Cold earth, damp wood, and the deep, sweet, rot-at-the-edges perfume of 200 bushels of apples waiting out the winter. Earl Whitfield pressed one boot onto the top step, felt it give slightly under his weight, the way it always did in November, and descended into the dark. He was 53 years old that autumn of 1958, and he had made this same walk down these same 12 steps every single morning from the first hard frost through the mud of April for as long as he could remember. His father had made it before him, and his grandfather before that on this same 40-acre spread outside Hendersonville, North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge came down off the ridge like a wall and turned October cold, fast and mean. The electric lines had finally reached their road in 1947, but the refrigerator his wife Eleanor had ordered from the Sears catalog in 1948 held butter and milk and last night's pork chops. It did not hold apples. Nothing held apples the way a root cellar held apples. Nothing came close. That was not sentiment. That was not the stubbornness of an old man clinging to the old ways because change made him nervous. That was a fact Earl had tested with his own hands and his own losses over 5 decades of farming, and the numbers bore it out every time. A bushel of apples stored wrong was a bushel of mush by Christmas. A bushel stored right could still put a firm, cold sweet apple in your hand come the second week of March, and on a working farm in the 1950s, where cash was tight from January through the first cuttings of June, a firm cold apple in March was not a small thing. It was breakfast. It was the difference between a child going to school with something in his belly or going hungry. It was cider vinegar for the whole following year. It was dried rings threaded on a string above the wood stove, and pie filling put up in jars and applesauce that Eleanor put on the table alongside pork 3 nights a week from Thanksgiving through Easter. The cellar under the Whitfield house was not a complicated structure. It was a hole, essentially, 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, walls lined with dry stacked stone that Earl's grandfather had pulled out of the upper pasture one rock at a time in the 1880s and fitted together without mortar, relying on weight and gravity and the density of the hillside itself to hold them in place. The floor was packed dirt. There were no shelves made of anything fancier than rough sawn poplar planks that Earl had cut himself at the sawmill down the road and dried for 2 summers before he trusted them with weight. The ceiling was the underside of the kitchen floorboards, and between those boards and the cellar air, there was a layer of sawdust 4 inches thick that Earl replenished every other year from the pile behind the mill. 2 small wooden-framed windows sat at ground level on the north wall, their glass replaced by sliding wooden panels that Earl worked by hand to manage the temperature below, open a crack when the cellar crept above 40 degrees, shut tight when the outside air dropped below 28. The target always was somewhere between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, not frozen, not warm, cold, still and dark. The way the earth itself was cold and still and dark, which was the point, because the earth had been storing things through winter since before anyone thought to write down how it was done. He moved the lantern along the rows and looked at his apples. He looked at them the way a doctor looks at a patient, not casually, not with the passive glance of a man satisfied, but with attention, with the specific focus of someone who knows what trouble looks like before it announces itself. He was looking for soft spots. He was looking for the particular dull sheen that came over the skin of an apple in the early stages of rot. The way the color changed at the stem end first, going slightly dark, slightly waterlogged, like a bruise working its way to the surface. He was looking for wrinkled skins, which meant moisture loss and meant the ventilation was wrong. He was looking for the white fuzz of mold, which meant temperature had crept up, or that he had missed a damaged fruit during packing, or that something with a bad skin had gotten in among the good ones and was now working its influence outward in every direction the way a bad apple in a barrel will always do, which was where that expression came from. And it was not a metaphor anyone on a working farm needed explained to them. He found two apples in the 3rd row from the left, toward the back wall, sitting in a wooden crate lined with dry grass, soft at the stem, skin beginning to go. He picked them up bare-handed and felt the give, not much, maybe a 1/4 inch of depression under his thumb, and set them in the bucket he carried for exactly this purpose. Those 2 apples were not wasted. They would go to the pigs before noon. But they would not stay in this cellar another hour, because what they carried, the enzymes, the bacteria, the invisible chemistry of decomposition, spread through the air and through contact, and through the ethylene gas that every apple in the world exhaled as it aged. And a cellar full of apples breathing ethylene at each other was a cellar that would age itself to mush inside of 6 weeks if a man did not intervene. Ethylene. Earl Whitfield did not know that word. He would have looked at you sideways if you had walked into his cellar on that November morning in 1958 and started talking about ethylene gas. But he knew the thing the word described with the absolute precision of a man who had learned it through loss, the way farmers learned everything, by watching what happened, by identifying what he had done differently the years things went wrong, by talking to his father and his father's neighbors and the old men at the feed store, who had been putting apples down in the ground since before the turn of the century, and who had accumulated between them a body of knowledge that no university had bothered to write down yet, because nobody at a university had thought to ask. His father, Herbert Whitfield, had lost the better part of 400 bushels in the winter of 1921 because he had stored them in a barn cellar that was too warm and had not checked them often enough and had let 2 damaged fruits sit among the sound ones for 2 weeks before he noticed. Herbert told that story every single year. He told it the way you tell a story that cost you something, flat, specific, without drama, because the drama was already built into the numbers. 400 bushels. The market price that winter was 70 cents a bushel for good storage apples. $280, gone. In 1921, on a 40-acre farm in western North Carolina, $280 was not an abstraction. It was the mortgage payment. Herbert had told that story until the day he died in 1944, and Earl had heard it enough times that he could tell it himself in his sleep, which was why he was standing in this cellar at 5:30 in the morning in November with a lantern and a bucket, pulling 2 soft apples out of a crate of 200 before the damage spread. The system Earl used had not been invented by Earl. It had been developed over generations by farmers across the entire apple-growing belt of the United States, from the Hudson Valley in New York, down through the Appalachians into western North Carolina and Tennessee, west into the hill country of Virginia and Pennsylvania, north through the orchard country of Michigan and Wisconsin. Wherever apples grew and winters came hard, and families needed to eat through February and March on what they had put by in October. The principles were consistent everywhere, because the biology was consistent everywhere. Apples were alive. They were living tissue that continued to breathe and metabolize after they were picked from the tree. They consumed their own sugars. They emitted gases. They responded to temperature. They responded to humidity. They responded to the presence or absence of other apples going bad nearby. A farmer who understood these things, even if he understood them only as practical rules learned from his father rather than as biochemistry, could keep apples firm and good for 5 and 6 months. A farmer who ignored them lost his apples by January. The first rule was variety selection, and it was not a rule you applied in the cellar. It was a rule you applied in October, or better yet, in the spring when you were deciding what to plant. Not all apples stored equally, and every farmer in apple country knew which varieties held and which varieties did not. The winesap was a storage apple. It had been grown in American orchards since at least the late 1700s, recorded in the correspondence of nurserymen in Virginia and Pennsylvania before the Revolution was finished, and it was prized specifically because it kept. The skin was tough, the flesh was dense, the sugar content was high enough to resist deterioration, and the acidity was sharp enough to hold the flavor long past Christmas. A winesap pulled out of a properly built root cellar in February still had snap to it. A clean break when you bit through it, juice running. The balance of sweet and tart that made it worth growing in the first place. Earl had 12 winesap trees on the lower slope of his orchard, trees that his grandfather had planted in the 1890s, and those trees were the backbone of his winter storage. He also kept Ben Davis, another old variety that had dominated the commercial apple trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, specifically because it stored so well. Not the finest eating apple, a little mealy, a little bland, but firm as a rock through February and March, and good enough for cooking, for cider, for dried rings, For the dozen other uses apples served on a working farm, alongside those he kept a handful of York Imperial and Arkansas Black, both late-season varieties, with the dense flesh and thick skin that storage demanded. What he did not try to store were the early summer apples, the yellow transparent, the Lodi, the Duchess, because those were eating apples, harvest day apples. Apples that were perfect for 3 days in July and mealy and soft by the end of the week, and absolutely worthless underground by November. Every apple had its season, and the first thing a farmer had to know about storing apples was which ones were worth the effort. The second rule was harvest timing, and it was subtler than most people who had not grown apples understood. The instinct was to let apples get as ripe as possible on the tree, to wait for sweetness, for full color, for the moment of peak flavor. For eating fresh off the branch, that instinct was right. For storage, it was exactly backward. An apple picked at full ripeness had already begun the process of softening, had already committed to the chemistry of decay, and no root cellar in the world would stop that process. It could only slow it, and an apple that was already softening when it went into the cellar would be mush before Christmas. The apple that kept through winter was the apple picked 2 weeks before it was fully ripe, when the flesh was still dense and firm, when the seeds had just turned brown inside, when the starch had not yet fully converted to sugar. You could test it with a knife, cut the apple across its equator and look at the seeds. Brown seeds meant the apple had crossed the threshold from growing to ripening, and that was the window. Seeds just brown, flesh still firm, the full sweetness still locked up in starch form and not yet realized. That apple, picked at that moment and handled correctly, had months of life ahead of it. The apple left on the tree another 2 weeks had used up most of that time already. Earl picked his storage apples in the first and second weeks of October, before any of his neighbors who were eating fresh or selling at market. His wife Eleanor thought he was neurotic about it. She wanted to wait, wanted the apples to develop more color, more sweetness. And every year he explained it the same way his father had explained it to him, patiently. The way you explain things to someone you love, who does not have the scar tissue that comes from losing 400 bushels in 1921. He picked early. He had never lost a winter's storage to premature ripening. The third rule, and maybe the one that separated the farmers who really knew what they were doing from the ones who thought they knew, was handling. An apple was not a potato. A potato could take a knock, could get thrown into a bin from knee height, could sit under 200 pounds of other potatoes and come out in March without complaint. An apple was something else entirely. An apple bruised, and a bruise on an apple was not cosmetic. It was a wound, a breach in the skin through which bacteria entered and decay began, and that bruise would spread under the surface for an inch in every direction from the point of impact, invisible to the eye, until the apple was already compromised, already breathing its decay into the surrounding fruit. The rule on the Whitfield farm, learned from Herbert and enforced on the children from the time they were old enough to carry a bucket, was that every apple was placed, not dropped, not tossed, not let roll, placed, with 2 hands if necessary, into whatever it was going into. You placed it into the picking bucket, you placed it into the sorting bin, you placed it into the storage crate. Every apple, every time, no exceptions, because one dropped apple could ruin a dozen neighbors in the crate, and you wouldn't know it for 3 weeks. The picking bucket itself was a piece of equipment Earl had thought about more than most people thought about their cars. It was canvas, not metal, metal-dented apples, with a bottom that opened on a cord so the apples could be released gently at the bottom of the bin rather than tumbling from height. His grandfather had used a cloth-lined wooden bucket with a pivoting bottom that worked on the same principle. Every apple region in the country had developed its own version of the same solution to the same problem, because every apple region had learned the same lesson about bruising through the same avenue of loss. Sorting came next, and this was where October cold worked in the farmer's favor. Earl spread his harvested apples in a single layer on wooden tables in the barn, not piled, single layer, and spent 2 full days going through every apple by hand before anything went into the cellar. He was looking for cuts, for punctures from branches or wire or bird beaks, for bruises, for the early signs of any disease on the skin. Anything imperfect went into a separate pile, not thrown away, sorted to a different use. The bruised ones went to the press for cider within the week, before the bruise spread further. The ones with minor skin damage got cut and dried or cooked down for applesauce. Only the sound ones, the ones with no damage anywhere on the skin, went into the cellar. A single overlooked cut on a single apple in a crate of 30 was enough to contaminate the whole crate by December. The crates themselves were another point of care. Earl used shallow wooden crates, never more than 2 or 3 layers of apples deep, because stacking depth created pressure, and pressure created bruising at the bottom of a deep pile, the way you would not believe until you saw it. His grandfather had used barrels, which was the traditional American storage vessel for apples going back centuries. The great apple barrels of New England and New York that went by the tens of thousands into the cold storage warehouses of Boston and New York City every fall. The barrels that filled the holds of ships going to Europe in the 19th century, the barrels that appear in every inventory of a working American farm from colonial times through the early 20th century. Barrels were efficient for space and for transport. Barrels were also hard on apples at the bottom. By Earl's generation, most serious storage farmers in his county had moved to shallow crates or to individual wrapping, and the results bore out the change. Individual wrapping was the premium option, and for his best wine saps, the ones he was putting by for March eating, for the last weeks of winter when fresh food was a memory and the first green things were still 6 weeks away, Earl wrapped each apple individually in a square of newspaper before placing it in the crate. The newspaper was not magic. Its function was simple and practical. It reduced direct contact between apples, so that if one began to go, its skin did not touch its neighbors, slowing the transfer of the bacteria and mold that moved apple to apple through contact. It also provided a small amount of insulation against temperature swings, and it absorbed a little of the excess moisture that apples gave off as they breathed, which helped prevent the humid conditions that mold preferred. The newspaper also made inspection easier. A wrapped apple that had gone soft was immediately obvious because the paper would be damp and slightly sunken, and Earl could pull it out of the crate without disturbing the others. Eleanor saved newspapers through September specifically for this purpose. She stacked them in the corner of the kitchen, and the children were not allowed to use them for anything else. And when Earl came in from a long picking day, with mud on his boots and apple-sticky hands, and found that one of the boys had taken a section of the September stack to wrap something for school, there was a conversation about priorities that the boys remembered into adulthood. The wrapping technique itself was worth describing, because there was a wrong way to do it that defeated the purpose. You laid the sheet of newspaper flat, you placed the apple in the center, stem end down. You brought the 4 corners up over the fruit and tucked them under. Then rotated the package a quarter turn and pressed the remaining loose paper in against the sides. The goal was a snug wrap, not tight, not compressing the skin, but close enough that the paper stayed in place and the apple was not rattling around inside a loose paper bag. A loose wrap slid off in the crate and the apples ended up in direct contact anyway. Earl had showed his eldest son Robert how to wrap an apple correctly the same autumn Robert turned 8 years old. Sitting on an upturned crate in the barn on an October afternoon, the two of them working through a bushel together, while Herbert sat in the corner on a nail keg and offered comments. 3 generations, 1 October afternoon, 1 bushel of wine saps. Temperature management was the variable that required the most ongoing attention, and it was also the one most dependent on the specific geography of where a man farmed. The ideal storage temperature for apples, 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, is not easily achieved in all climates without engineering. In the mountains of western North Carolina, where the Whitfield farm sat, the ground temperature at 8 feet of depth stayed naturally in the mid-40s through the coldest months, which was close enough to work with if the ventilation was managed carefully. Further north, in Vermont or Michigan or Wisconsin, a cellar had to be protected from getting too cold, from dropping below 32 and freezing the fruit solid, which destroyed the cell walls and turned the apple to mush when it thawed. Further south, in Georgia or the Carolina Piedmont, the ground simply did not get cold enough without depth, and farmers in those areas relied more heavily on dried and preserved apple products than on fresh storage, because the root cellar math did not work in their climate. Earl managed his cellar temperature through those 2 north-facing wooden panel windows. and through a small wooden vent in the floor of the kitchen above that he could open or close with a rope from the cellar itself. On a mild November night, when the outside air was 38 degrees and the cellar was creeping up to 43, he opened both north windows a crack and let the cold air flow in along the floor. Cold air was denser than warm air and flowed low, which was why the windows were at ground level and not higher on the wall. On a hard January night, when the outside temperature dropped to 15 or 18 degrees, both windows were shut tight and the kitchen vent was cracked slightly to let the warmth from the wood stove seep down just enough to keep the cellar above freezing. It was not a thermostat. It was a man making judgments twice a day, based on what the thermometer in the cellar told him, and what the sky outside told him, and what his father had told him about the specific behavior of this specific cellar in this specific hollow, where the cold air pooled off the ridge in a way that the neighbors a mile up the road did not have to contend with. He kept a thermometer nailed to the center post of the cellar, a glass tube thermometer in a wooden case that had hung in that spot since Herbert had put it there in the 1920s after losing a portion of a storage to a hard freeze he had not seen coming fast enough. The thermometer was not a luxury. It was not a nicety. It was as essential to the operation of the cellar as the apples themselves, and Earl read it every morning when he came down with his lantern and every evening before he went to bed, and the reading went into a small paper notebook he kept on the shelf by the stairs, date and temperature in pencil. Because Herbert had kept such a notebook, and the record of what the cellar had done in past winters was useful for predicting what it would do in this one. Humidity was the other variable, and it worked in tension with temperature in ways that made management genuinely tricky. Too dry, and the apples shriveled, lost moisture through their skins at a rate that left them mealy and soft by midwinter, still edible but diminished, the texture gone. Too humid, and mold moved in, not dramatically, not all at once, but the invisible web of fungal growth that started in the corners of the crates and spread, given time and warmth and moisture, until whole layers of fruit were lost. The right humidity for apple storage was somewhere between 80 and 90% relative humidity, high but not saturated. Earl achieved this the way his father had achieved it, through the earthen floor of the cellar itself, which released moisture steadily into the air, and through occasional adjustment with a pan of water set on the floor in the driest months, and through attentiveness, which was what it came down to in the end, with every aspect of root cellar management: attentiveness. Showing up every day, and looking and adjusting and looking again. There was a saying in Henderson County that Earl had heard from his father and the old men at the cooperative extension meetings: the cellar doesn't keep apples. The farmer keeps apples. The cellar is just where he does it. Earl thought that was right. He had seen neighbors with beautiful stone cellars, better built than his, deeper, more carefully constructed, lose their storage every other year because they packed the apples in October and came back in January expecting to find them sound and were surprised every time to find them going. The cellar was the tool. The daily attention was the practice. And the knowledge that made the attention productive was the inheritance. Passed from father to son across the generations of American farm families, in root cellars and dugouts and spring houses and stone-lined pits all across the country, for longer than anyone had thought to write it down. The history of apple storage in America was older than the country itself. The first apple trees in the English colonies came over as seeds and grafted wood in the early 1600s, brought by settlers who understood that apples were not merely food, but preservation insurance. A crop that could be stored, dried, fermented, and pressed against the long months when nothing grew. Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, the real historical figure, an Ohio nurseryman who planted orchards across the frontier from the 1790s into the 1840s, was planting cider apples, not eating apples, because cider was the liquid form of preservation that allowed the caloric value of the orchard to travel in barrels through winter and spring. By the time Earl Whitfield's grandfather was planting those 12 winesap trees on the lower slope in the 1890s, the tradition of root cellar apple storage was already 2 centuries deep in American farm life, and the specific knowledge embedded in it lived not in books but in practice, in the conversations at the feed store and the Grange Hall, in the stories fathers told sons about the years things went wrong and exactly what had been done differently afterward. The county agent who came around in the 1940s, a young man named Davis from the Agricultural Extension Service at North Carolina State, had shown Earl pamphlets about apple storage developed by university research stations. Earl had read them and found, with quiet satisfaction, that they described almost exactly what he was already doing, just with more formal language. What the pamphlets did add was the specific biology behind something Earl had always known as a rule without a name. Apples produced a naturally occurring gas called ethylene as they ripened, and that gas accelerated the decay of nearby fruit, which was why removing soft apples was not merely tidiness, but an active intervention in the chemistry of the cellar. It also explained why you kept varieties separated, why you never stored apples against potatoes or onions. Earl had always done those things because his father had done them. Now he knew why. He went home and reorganized his cellar layout more deliberately along varietal lines, and his wine saps lasted slightly longer for it. The old knowledge had been right. The new knowledge made it better. That was about the best a farmer could ask for. Eleanor understood this, even if she had not grown up on an apple farm. She had come from a tobacco family in Surrey County, married Earl at 22, and spent the first several years of their marriage learning the apple cellar, the way she learned everything, by watching and asking and doing, and by recognizing that the knowledge her husband carried in his hands and his habits had been earned and was worth learning. She took over the morning cellar inspection in the winters of 1950 and 51, when Earl was down with a back injury that the doctor in Hendersonville had told him to rest for 6 weeks, which was advice Earl followed for approximately 4 days before he started doing light work again, but which Eleanor enforced with the specific authority of a woman whose family's winter food supply was in those crates. She found 3 soft apples on the 3rd morning and pulled them without hesitation. She adjusted the north window that same afternoon when the cellar thermometer read 44. She kept the notebook. She was not doing anything Earl would not have done. She was doing exactly what Earl would have done because she had paid attention. Their children grew up with the cellar as a given, the way farm children grew up with every element of the farm, not as a special project or a learning opportunity, but as a fact of life, a daily reality that required participation. Robert and his younger brother James carried the inspection bucket by the time they were 10. Their sister Carol learned to wrap apples for long-term storage the same autumn she turned 8, sitting on the same upturned crate where Earl had learned it from Herbert, learning it from Earl. The knowledge moved through the family the way it moved through all farm families of that era, not through formal instruction, but through participation, through presence, through the 1,000 repetitions that embedded a practice in muscle memory and habit, until it was simply what you did, simply how winter worked, simply the way life was organized on a 40-acre farm in the Blue Ridge foothills, where the cold came down off the mountain in October and did not let go until April. By the mid-1960s, things were changing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow way that agriculture always changed in the 20th century, through economics, through technology, through the consolidation of small farms into larger operations, through the supermarket supply chain that was bringing fresh produce from California and Florida into the grocery stores of small towns that had previously relied on local production and home storage for their winter food. The A&P that opened in downtown Hendersonville in 1963 carried apples 12 months a year, Washington State Delicious in waxed paper bags, and the price was low enough that a family could buy apples through February without a root cellar if they had the cash to spend at the grocery store. Many families did, increasingly. Many families stopped putting apples by. Earl was not sentimental about this in the way that city people, looking back, sometimes imagined the old farmer ought to be. He was practical. He recognized that the economics of home apple storage made more sense when the alternative was going without than when the alternative was a bag of Delicious from the A&P for 39 cents. He recognized that the Delicious, that red, photogenic, commercially bred variety that had taken over the American apple market by the 1960s at the expense of almost every old variety worth tasting, was not a wine sap. He had tasted them. His grandchildren preferred the Delicious because it was large and red and sweet, and they had grown up seeing it in stores, the way you preferred what you knew. He ate a wine sap from his cellar in February and held it against any delicious anyone could produce, and felt no need to argue the point further. But the economics were the economics. Robert, his eldest, had gone to work at the textile mill in Brevard after his army service in 1957, and was not going to farm the Whitfield land. James had married a girl from Asheville and was doing construction work in the county. Carol was in Raleigh teaching school. The farm would not stay a farm, or at least not the kind of farm it had been. The kind of farm where 200 bushels of apples needed to come through a winter because the alternative was going without. Earl and Eleanor were still there, still farming on a reduced scale, still putting apples by because the habit was 50 years deep, and because he could tell the difference between a cellared wine sap in February and anything a grocery store had to offer, and because the cellar was there, the trees were there, the knowledge was there, and there was no particular reason to stop. He came up from the cellar that November morning in 1958 with his 2 bad apples in the bucket, came up into the kitchen where Eleanor was at the wood stove with coffee already made, set the bucket by the back door, and poured himself a cup. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 31 degrees. The cellar thermometer had read 38. He had adjusted the north window a 1/4 inch more closed before he came up. He would check again at noon. Eleanor put a plate of biscuits on the table and sat down across from him and asked how the cellar looked. "Fine," he said. "2 soft ones in the 3rd crate. The rest are solid." She nodded. She poured her own coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the light was coming up grey and slow over the ridge, the kind of November light that had no warmth in it yet, the kind of light that told you winter was not coming but was already here, had already settled in, and the question was not whether you were ready, but whether the preparation you had done in October was going to be enough. It always came down to that, on a farm in the mountains in November, whether what you had done when the weather was still good was going to carry you through when it was not. Earl thought it would. He had 214 good apples left in that cellar after pulling the 2 soft ones wrapped in newspaper and sitting in shallow crates on poplar shelves in the cold dark, breathing slow, holding themselves in the long still pause between harvest and the first warm days that would eventually come, inevitably, off the ridge, in April, when the trees would blossom again and the whole enterprise would start over. He had done what his father had done, and his father's father before him. He had picked early and handled carefully, and sorted thoroughly and watched the temperature, and pulled the bad ones before they spread. He had done what generations of American farm families had done, in root cellars and dugouts and spring houses and stone-lined pits all across the country, to get their food through the winter. It was not complicated. It was not magic. It was knowledge, and patience and daily attention, and the particular kind of competence that comes from doing a thing the right way, the hard way, the slow way, for long enough that you stop thinking about it as a technique and start knowing it as simply the way things are done. The coffee was hot. The biscuits were fresh. Outside, the first snow of the season was starting to come down off the ridge, light and dry, the kind that didn't stick yet but told you what was coming. Earl watched it through the window and finished his coffee and went to put on his coat. There was work to do. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. It means everything to this channel and to the mission of keeping these stories alive. If this video gave you something, a memory, a piece of knowledge, a moment of recognition, please take a second and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Leave us a like if you enjoyed it, and if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of history, share it with them. Every share helps us reach more people who care about where American rural life came from and what it knew. This video is inspired by real historical events, real farming practices, and real communities. It does not aim to represent or offend any individual, family, or group. Earl Whitfield is a representative character. He reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American apple farmers who navigated exactly these challenges during this era, in these same mountains with these same tools, this same knowledge, and this same daily discipline. His story is their story.